So let's start, and I'll leave the door open for a little bit longer, so people might still be coming in. And on the side, I'm going to warm up my Sharepoint portfolio. Okay, so before I forget, there is a DevWeek app available both on iOS and Android. Apparently it's on the speaker's information pack and the website and all, but I just found out about it. And the reason I must mention it is because it is through the app that they're taking feedbacks. So after the session, if you think I did a good job, if you could please leave some feedback, I'd really appreciate that. And if you think I did a sucky job, you can leave feedback even then. But actually, if you can ignore that, that'd be great. But okay, so let's start with starting SharePoint development. So the title of this session is like really long. It said, I want to start with SharePoint development, but I don't know where to start, or something like that. So I couldn't fit that on the slide deck. So I just shortened it to starting SPDev. So let me start with a quick question. How many of us here are current SharePoint developers? Like we're actively developing SharePoint. 2010 or 2013? 2013. Started playing with? 2010. Started playing with apps? Yeah? Okay. And how many of us here are .NET developers? Okay, cool. So this session, the aim of this session, this particular session, is starting with a .NET developer and interested in SharePoint, sitting on the fence. I've heard about it. People keep talking about it. People have some strong opinions about it. And should I dive in? What is it going to take to dive in? And for the experienced SharePoint developers, hopefully there'll be a few nuggets as well. At this conference, I have 4 talks. Yesterday I had a pre-con also, which was aimed towards an overall view of SharePoint developers in general. And I have a post-con that dives into the app model only. So think of the post-con as a zoomed-in view of a very narrow topic, and that very narrow topic is also a very important topic going forward. So if SharePoint development going forward is important to you, especially in Office 365 and so on and so forth, the post-con could possibly be very interesting to you. And I have 4 talks at this conference, and those talks are, let's see. So this is the first one. Then I have 3 talks on Thursday. At 9:30 in the morning, I'm going to talk about custom security trimming for search in SharePoint 2013. So you know that SharePoint 2013 has the fast search engine integrated into it, and that opens a lot of possibilities for us. You may have other business systems in your companies, like Documentum or et cetera, et cetera. There are probably a lot of them. What I'm going to walk through in that particular session is how can you write a custom connector to crawl other sources, and then how can you add security information on top so they respect the backend security on top of SharePoint security. So that will be that session. I would call that a level 400 session. That's a level 400 session. I'll be walking through the search architecture as well. So if you're extremely interested in SharePoint, either from the value of search or implementation of what is possible, that session will be very interesting. Day 4 is again a very high overview of the last post-con that I'm going to go through the apps model at zip zap zoom speed. And the other session, CSOM and REST, can also be considered part of the apps model, where I'm going to talk and go deep into the client-side object model and REST API. With that, let me start with this session, which is starting SharePoint development. I'm going to keep talking, I'm going to quickly close the door. So as I already mentioned, what is this session about? A little bit about myself. I run a small company out of Washington, DC. We have clients in these countries around the world, but we're only a 9-people company, so we take very specific projects, advanced projects to deal with both Microsoft and iOS. That's our work-life balance. And I have written 15 books, 2 of them on SharePoint, and with that, I will start with the actual content. Right now, we're at a fork in the road. I'm going to keep talking, I'm going to just quickly close the door. So right now, we're at a fork in the road because we're being pushed to the cloud. And, you might have heard of this phrase, cloud at your own terms. I wish, because what's going on right now is, for various reasons, beneficial for both us and the software provider, as in Microsoft. We are being pushed to the cloud. And this is not news to you, but let's consider the reasons why we are being pushed to cloud. You're in the business of developing software, and how often does it happen that you build something and you hand it to your IT ogre, and he deploys it for you, and he won't let you touch the servers, right? Does that happen? And the IT ogre is a real pain, isn't he? Maybe we work with the same guy, but he has a role, right? And the way we have to, I frequently think that if that IT ogre wasn't in the picture, if I could deploy stuff myself, I could get things done so much quicker. Now put yourself in Microsoft's shoes. They are dealing with hundreds and thousands of IT ogres around the world, us, right? We are their customer, and we expect Microsoft to deliver complicated functionality, and the functionality is getting more and more complex every day in a shrink-wrapped form. So it's almost like landing the Mars rover on Mars, that everything must work perfectly for this complex software to work. That's the challenge they're running into. So when they operate things in the cloud, Microsoft can move quicker, and they can deliver us more complex functionality quicker. That's reason number one why we are moving to the cloud, is because companies, Microsoft and others, can give us compelling functionality quicker. Second, you can't pirate stuff in the cloud. It's subscription based. Every software requires you to log in, and if your subscription expires, the software dies after a while. Third, for various taxation rules, etc., people are moving to the cloud as well, because when you buy software, it's a property you own, and then you owe property taxes on it. But if you buy a subscription, at the end of the year, you can write off the whole amount in that year, right? So for companies, it is also more beneficial from a tax perspective to buy an Office 365 subscription rather than to buy Office professional licenses. Now, I understand there are a lot of laws and legalities, and people are not comfortable with putting their information in the cloud. That will change. With time, that will change. Because number one, money talks, right? Over time, cloud is going to get cheaper. Your competitors are going to move to the cloud, and if you're going to provide the same service or inferior service for 10 times the cost, it's not going to matter, right? It's a question of managing risk. Number two, obviously, is that all the new functionality, all the new cool stuff is going to come out in the cloud. So Microsoft just released Office for iPad a couple of days ago, and it is tied to Office 365. I don't work for Microsoft, but I have a strong premonition that everything they're going to do in the future is going to be tied with Office 365, on the Office side of things. So, cloud is unavoidable, right? And if it's made into Dilbert, it's probably, big time. Okay, so the cloud story in SharePoint is a little bit like this right now. We have on-premises SharePoint, which Microsoft has promised that there will be at least one more release of, but I think there'll be another two, right? So the next version is going to be out in 2015, and they just released SharePoint 2013 Service Pack 1. And this is the on-premises version where we download SharePoint and we set up our own server and install it. Yes, the server could be in Azure, but we control the entire server. Then the 100% cloud version is Office 365, where SharePoint is a part of a subscription you buy, and the other things you may get on top are Link, Office, and Exchange, right? So for a per user per month fee, and there are a lot of choices and nuances over there that you can buy what you will use and pay accordingly. So Microsoft offers a lot of choices over there. But we're talking specifically about SharePoint. So like the enterprise plans and the P plans, etc., you'll be able to get SharePoint in that. And then you have a hybrid story. So the idea is that we spent the last 30 years writing software for on-premises. A lot of our SharePoint solutions integrate with software that is on-premises. Things are not going to move to the cloud overnight. So we're going to spend a lot of time in the middle over here, in the hybrid area first, before we go to 100% cloud. And the reason I put this slide up here is that do not underestimate the complexity of setting up a hybrid environment or the move to the cloud. If you're a small company buying Office 365, it's rather simple. You go online, enter credentials, enter your credit card info, set up a few users, and you're ready to go within an hour, right? You want to add your own domain to it? All right, that's another maybe maybe a day for the DNS entries to propagate. It's really that simple. But when it starts getting complicated is when you are moving functionality from on-premises to the cloud. So I did a project for a client where it was like 2,000 users, and the idea was that they were going to move from on-premises Exchange to Office 365 Exchange. They bought Office 365 mainly for Exchange. And let me give you some examples of the kinds of issues I ran into in that migration. Number one, I had to set up a tool called DirSync to sync their identities, or rather a skeleton of their identities. Like we didn't sync passwords up there in that case, even though that is possible, rather you sync a hash of a password. But what we did is that we synced up the skeleton of their identities into Azure AD. So first we had to set up their Azure ADs, sync DirSync, and then setting up DirSync, making it available for high availability, which DirSync doesn't really do. So we had to set up a machine in Azure, and we had to create a VPN connection because Azure gives us high availability. And then DirSync in itself does not support syncing everything that works on premises. So there are a lot of rules. So what you have to do is that you have to clean up your entire Active Directory, right? So there are a lot of rules, like the username cannot be more than 64 characters, right? On-premises allows that. Office 365 does not, right? So there is actually about 3 or 4 pages of rules that we have to go through, and we had to clean up all the accounts. And then we had to create exclusion rules, right? And then we created exclusion rules because we didn't want to sync up schema admins and domain accounts. We didn't even want to sync up those names because that's leakage of information, right? And then DirSync was set up, and were we done? Not really, because there were some accounts that had to stay on premises because they were somewhat online, offline, so we had to figure out a solution for that. And then we had to sync up, change the MX rules and all that, and this is just for moving mailboxes into the cloud. And you know what happened? We did all this over a weekend, and people came in on Monday, and the biggest complaint that we heard, and they were making a lot of noise about this, is that when people issued a search in Outlook on Friday, they got different results than they did on Monday, right? That's the level of expectation that we get measured with. So my point, and that's just for moving mailboxes, okay? That's just for moving mailboxes. If people's emails don't work, if they don't get those funny cat videos, the whole company stops, right? You know that. So, move to hybrid, do not underestimate it. The second thing, all the cool features, I think I already mentioned this, all the cool features that you will see coming in the future on the Office and SharePoint platform, my guess, and I'm seeing evidence of this, is they're probably going to be only on the cloud. So the best way I can put it is on-premises was Microsoft's old dog that is about to die. And it's been put in hospice. It's got about 2-3 years to live, maybe 5 at best. But they just got a new puppy called Office 365, and everybody loves the new puppy. The new puppy's cute and plays all the tricks and all that. So the new puppy is getting all the treats. And what's going to happen in the next release of SharePoint, and we already see this in SP1, and frankly even in SharePoint 2013 a little bit, is that the bones that have been thrown by the puppy are making it to on-premises. So you have social integration, right? So you have a Yammer story. SharePoint Social is a dead end. We know that, right? So Yammer can be integrated with on-premises right now, but Yammer does not have an on-prem story. You have to have an Office 365 tenancy. You see the Office Marketplace, right? The SharePoint Marketplace. All the apps that are available over here, you cannot install them on premises unless you set up an Office 365 tenancy. SharePoint apps can be trusted, either the SharePoint hosted apps, which suck. I'll cover why on day 4. But SharePoint hosted apps, I think once you start looking into this, you practically won't use them. That's my opinion. Some people will disagree. But then you have provider hosted apps in which you have 2 ways to trust the app into SharePoint, either using S2S Trust or using OAuth. And again, S2S Trust is a very crippled way, like a lot of things don't work. For instance, you cannot do all the fly permissions. You cannot use server-side code and client-side code in the same app at the same time, right? You have to choose. And that's a big limitation. But if you go with OAuth, you have none of these limitations, right? So again, and to go with OAuth, even on premises, you're going to need an Office 365 tenancy. You're going to have to create a hybrid farm in which you're going to have to consume the managed services of the cloud, because you cannot make it work without Azure AD and Azure ACS. You cannot make OAuth work without that. Now again, you might think, why did Microsoft give us an on-premises solution for OAuth? Because if they did, it would be really difficult for us around the world to set up the equivalent of an on-premises Azure ACS. And how many of us would get that wrong? And that would technically be a security hole, and then SharePoint gets a bad name, right? So they're making things actually simpler for us, but I understand that a lot of companies are going to have a hard time going into the cloud. Cloud also requires us to think in a different way. This morning, I was having breakfast with another fellow speaker at DevWeek, Italian Gatino Esposito, and we were talking about something rather interesting, that how .NET used to be in 2005. That before they released .NET, all the documentation came out in beta 2. And the product was so polished by the time it came out. We all know that is not the case today. RTM is the new beta. Beta is the new alpha, right? So when they release SharePoint as an RTM product, there are still so many issues in it. For instance, did you know that when SharePoint 2013 RTM, apps could not work with alternate access mappings? So you had to pick one URL for your SharePoint installation, which in 90% of the cases is not the case. They added that support in March, and SharePoint was released in October. So for 5 months, that is what they had released. And even now, if you look at all the things that have been fixed in Service Pack 1, you're like, really? You fixed this like a year later? And it's not just SharePoint that is doing this. So things are being released a lot more raw, and they're being updated a lot more frequently. And this is just something that we have to get used to. In the cloud, they are updating things every week. In Office 365, they push updates every week, and this creates a unique challenge for us, because every week they're going to push an update. They don't give us a prior warning that they'll push out an update. And the worst part is that different tenants get updated at different times. So if I write a product that is installed on 3 different Office 365 sites, 3 different customers, one customer may get updated at a different time than the other. So it becomes a little hard for me to support that. And again, even if I was supporting just one customer, still things can update without prior warning, and then I would get an error. So it requires some interesting dev mechanisms or better practices for us to isolate from all of that. A lot of SharePoint features are missing or pruned down in the cloud. For instance, and pruned down, but then they're adding things to make up for it. Like for instance, BI. A lot of BI things don't work in Office 365, but now they're introducing some features that work only in Office 365. And speaking of apps, I think I've already covered this, so let's go over it quickly. Pure on-prem apps are not going to migrate to the cloud easily. So, as you know that in developing for SharePoint, you can write either WSPs or you can write apps. And we say that apps is a good idea because going into the cloud is going to be easier if you write apps. The reality is that we're at a fork in the road and we're diverging, right? As in, we're starting with Office right now when their Office 365 and on-premises are quite similar to each other, but little by little the APIs are going to diverge, right? So you saw that at the last SPC they released the Office 365 developer APIs, right? So right now it's a very, very early preview. Basically what that is, that it's a multi-home refresh token, and they built something called as the common consent framework. So the user says okay once and then gets access to multiple resources behind the scenes. Right now they're starting with very few, like mail and a couple of others. I forgot which one, which is just very few APIs as of now. But those APIs that they've introduced, and they've clearly said that they're going to introduce more, those APIs are not present on premises, right? So what's going to happen is that people are going to write code and applications that will work only in the cloud. So, and also your on-premises APIs, some of them will not be present in the cloud. So if you think that your on-premises code is going to migrate to Office 365 easily, if you do it now, probably yes. But if you wait longer, it's going to get harder and harder and harder because these APIs are going to get more and more different. So one day we will have to migrate to the cloud. And that means you're going to have to worry about functionality and content. And I talked about functionality so far. Farm solutions, not going to move to the cloud. Sandbox, with exceptions, they might move to the cloud. Apps, with some work, they may move to the cloud. But the harder part is content, right? You cannot back up your content database on premises and attach it to Office 365. So migrating content to Office 365, right now there is no good answer to that. Right? There might be some third-party libraries and all, but that's another thing that you need to consider. So anyway, I'll get to, let's jump over the cloud talk a little bit and just jump over how to handle or how to deliver SharePoint functionality. Delivering SharePoint functionality, it's different from a regular .NET project. In a regular .NET project, we are given requirements. We analyze requirements. We come up with an architecture. We build in things to manage change, right? And then we try and meet the requirements. The key over here is that we get to draw the picture on a clean, blank sheet of paper. SharePoint-based projects, and I would say COTS, custom off-the-shelf software-based projects, are a little bit different. Because you have already made a choice of a platform. So it would help us if we were to take the advantages of that platform and see what that platform gives us and consider that as a part of the solution. Quite often, I've seen SharePoint projects in which they would treat it like a regular .NET project. How many times have we heard business first? Business drives technology. And there is nothing wrong with that. Business drives technology. But if you have made the choice of using SharePoint, then ignoring what SharePoint gives you is not a good idea. And at the same time, working against the grain of SharePoint is also not a good idea. So whenever you get a SharePoint project, you should try and first deliver it using browser only. Then you may go to thick clients in which a power user can use Excel or Access, and I used to say InfoPath, but InfoPath sucks. And then the last approach is Visual Studio, right? More expensive, middle expensive, least expensive. And of course, there's a whole science in how to structure such a project, how to break apart such a project. But you have to break apart such a project and balance it with all of the other things on the other side. Cost. What are the skills available in our company? What can we hire? The SLAs we need to offer. What kind of security should we have? QA to production migration story. How will we handle that? Usually things that we do through the browser, for instance, the QA to production migration story of that is get the same guy who did it in QA and have him repeat the very same steps in production. Not a very good story. If you want a good QA to production story, maybe you want to go with Visual Studio. High availability and disaster recovery, right? And most important, user experience. A good example is workflows. People want to create an approval workflow right out of the box. How many times have you heard? Out of the box, you have an approval workflow. Point-click setup. But the user experience isn't like send for approval. It's not like that. It's usually I've created a document, then I go to this menu, and then there is no choice. There's a triple ellipsis there, and I click on that, and then I go to a link called workflows. Then I look for a link over there, and that link might be different in different environments. And I click on that, and I click on start a workflow. It's like 5 clicks to send for approval, right? So the user experience may not be the best, but the way to put that to the end user is say, hey, the user experience isn't great, but you'll have this today, right? But you can get better user experience, but it'll take us 2 months. And if you pose that question to users, some of them may say, yeah, we'll go with what we can get today. Some of them, not all, right? The good news is now that with workflows, as an example, you have a good CSOM and REST API to work with workflows now. And you can create a custom UI on top of workflows relatively easier than last versions, right? So again, one of the challenges that I've seen with SharePoint is, people bring in SharePoint and then they try and reinvent the wheel in SharePoint. And I've seen things like, let's totally remove search and we're going to build our own search, right? Why? You have the best enterprise class search engine built into SharePoint. Why not use it? So, when we talk of browser only, there's an interesting way to think of it. Technically, it is less headache for IT because end users can build whatever they want on your own. And then you train the end users, right? We give them training, we educate, we create smarter end users, right? Here's one thing to consider. When you create smarter end users, they will figure out all the simple things themselves. That does not mean that they will not have problems. They will just have more difficult problems. And they're going to hit IT with those more difficult problems. So think of it this way. Imagine that you're working in a big company that deals with finance stuff, and they are Excel gurus in business users that are far better at Excel than people in the IT department, right? We don't go around helping them with Excel formulae. We don't, right? So when you roll out SharePoint in this manner, roll it out with the right expectation. As in, IT's responsibility here is to restore your site collection. If you screw up, we'll bring you back to 1 week before. But that's the best we can do. If you break security permissions, if you create an info path form that is just not behaving nice, can't help you, right? So generally what I like to do is that I like to roll out my SharePoint installation in 2 halves. One half is like a nicely controlled area. You know, like I've been to a lot of Eastern European countries, and one of the common things that I've seen in all the capitals of all of these countries is that they have a downtown like Kremlin or whatever that is very nicely kept. It's beautiful. And then you go further out, like St. Petersburg. They have like 4 blocks that are just literally like Paris. It's beautiful, right? Even better than Paris, I would say. But then you go further out and it's so darn poor, right? It's really, really poor. People have their teeth missing outside. So that, imagine your SharePoint installation to be like an old socialist empire, right? There should be a part of it that should be nicely polished, kept very nicely clean, and that's what users see. That's the homepage of your SharePoint in front end. And everybody doesn't get access on that. Build this using the publishing site, brand it nicely, have a consistent navigation, and then have a Wild West area that is team sites, okay? And have a backlink from the team site to come back to the clean area so users never get lost, right? And that way, you're going to solve both needs. You're going to give the users the power of SharePoint, right? So a lot of people just get in SharePoint and they lock it down to a point that they can't use it. I call it getting married, that we have a pool of money and neither of us spend it, right? We just circle around it all of our lives. So that's like getting a Ferrari. We'll never drive it, we just polish it every day. What's the point of getting a Ferrari? That's at least how I think of it. So use SharePoint, you bought it, you paid for it, but have an area that's nicely cleaned up, locked down, and that is where your more reliable artifacts go, like the lunch menu. So, as I mentioned, so I just covered this, so the reality, and again, another thing to consider is that business users will never approach a problem from a high-level view like IT does. Just like we're not experts at their domain, they are not experts at our domain, right? And frequently in a project, I would go to the extent of saying that we need to get into their domain for a project to be successful because they will never get into our domain, right? In a world where everything is getting automated and software is the #1 job out there, there's still some people who hate computers, right? I'm sure you know a few of them. So business users will never actually view the problem for high level. So they'll basically bring you to a mountain and they'll say, drill me a tunnel through this, okay? As in, how many times have we heard, we've gotten everything working except security, except branding. And I say, right, so for me to fix this one little thing, I have to unravel everything you've done, right? And then I frequently ask, say in a meeting when I'm posed with such a question, all right, let's step back for a second. What is it that you're trying to do? Well, I'm trying to get to the other side of the mountain, so why don't we just drive around it? And this sort of vision is something that IT would have, right? So again, this is why we just rolls things out with certain mechanisms. So the approaches that I use in a SharePoint project is browser only, think client only. Business users can deal with it with their own, and we roll it out with a different level of SLA. And Visual Studio is basically where developers jump in, where you cannot do things using browser and think clients, right? So, and why exactly do I not like to attack with every problem using Visual Studio is because custom dev is the most expensive thing you can do with SharePoint. Custom dev with SharePoint is more expensive than .NET because, as an example, the SharePoint CSS is about 12,000 lines long, whereas a regular .NET project, 200 lines, 400 lines. And the complexity isn't 6 times more. You guys know CSS, you know it's more, it goes exponentially higher, right? SharePoint JavaScript is inconsistent between different site definitions, and it is huge. The SharePoint JavaScript is huge. The basic theme site, when you first load it and hit F5, it downloads 5 megabytes of HTML and JavaScript. Just think of that. Just a simple example, right? And that's just the out-of-the-box theme site. So SharePoint JavaScript, SharePoint CSS is far, far, far more complicated than your regular .NET project, which is why developing inside SharePoint is very, very expensive. So, again, SharePoint dev versus .NET dev, again, it's more complex, but another thing to consider is that we didn't write this product. We inherited it. And some people will argue that there are a lot of issues with the product. It's like a big sausage factory. And it's mired in old technologies that we're never going to get out of. It'll always be web forms. We cannot use MVC. We cannot use Web API. Right? All those new nice platforms you see, we can't use them in SharePoint. And that sort of sucks. So they gave us a nice alternative. Earlier, we used to write SharePoint code within SharePoint. It ran inside SharePoint. That meant to do anything, we had to deal with the intricacies of SharePoint. And this is the model that we used in SharePoint 2007. That was called as Farm Solutions. And Farm Solutions, the problem with Farm Solutions was that they were too powerful. So in 2007, Microsoft came out with a guidance in which they said that if you want to deploy things in the gap where they get full trust, then you have to consciously say allow gap deployment. And that is still there in the current version of SharePoint. But here's the dirty secret. 99% of the SharePoint code is in the gap. Right? The reason for that is not putting it in the gap required us to write CAST policies, code access security policies. And just writing a CAST policy doesn't mean that you're more secure. So people started writing CAST policies that were very liberal. So now you had another problem. You weren't more secure, but you had so many CAST policies to manage. This wasn't working out. So in SharePoint 2010, they gave us sandbox solutions. Sandbox solutions, over time we got to know that they were sandbox solutions because they're very restricted. But that was their problem, that they were so restricted that you couldn't do anything with them. So in 2013, Microsoft said that they're deprecated. But the funny thing is that a lot of functionality that was released in SharePoint 2013 relied on sandbox solutions, so they cannot be deprecated, right? So what is really deprecated in 2013? Sandbox solutions are not deprecated. Sandbox solutions with C# in them, sandbox solutions with DLLs in them are deprecated. User code is deprecated. Sandbox solutions in which you write code purely declaratively using Camel are not deprecated, right? But they gave us a much better model. They looked at what Facebook was doing. And Facebook, they saw that the most popular app like Farmville did not run on Facebook's servers. It ran outside of Facebook servers. And it interacted with Facebook using well-defined APIs. As a result, they could move that custom code outside of SharePoint. And this custom code could now talk to SharePoint over well-defined APIs under well-defined permissions called REST and CSOM. And this was the new apps model. And the advantage of embracing this apps model is that now you can treat custom development like a custom .NET project. Right? Now, let me be honest, the apps model also has a lot of shortcomings. It has a lot of holes. But there is one thing that I've seen that a lot of SharePoint devs are still making this mistake, is that when they write an app, they are still thinking SharePoint. They still think that they're writing a SharePoint app. So the first thing they do, they write an app and they try and stick it in a web part inside of SharePoint itself. why does the user have to be given this URL? The user could be given that URL. Apps by definition live on a completely different URL. And then if the user never sees SharePoint, then you have complete control on the user experience. You have complete control on the navigation. You have complete control on whatever you wish to do. You can use whatever libraries you want. You can use MVC, you can use Web API, and you can use SharePoint for what it is good at. Hey, we want to use user profiles. Okay, there's a REST CSOM API for that. We want to use workflows. All right, there's a REST CSOM API for that too. We want to use search. Right? We don't have to surface up SharePoint's HTML to take advantage of all of those features anymore. Right? That's a pretty good way of approaching these apps. And I'll cover these in detail in a post-con workshop. But again, how it does not help is because this guy just came back from a Microsoft conference and saw something really cool, and he thinks it's going to take 2 seconds to do that. Right? So sometimes we still run into the and we might deal with a lot of legacy code. So the picture is not going to be like all rosy. But I think we start moving in that direction, it could be nice. So, this is my last slide, and after which I'll dive into demos. When we talk of SharePoint development, and I'm talking purely in a developer realm, we talk of either writing console applications. Console applications are good if you are exploring the API. We're never going to deploy things into production using console applications. Because every time you deploy a SharePoint solution, it does an IIS reset. And every time you do an IIS reset, it takes forever for the SharePoint page to render again. That's good. You're going to lose 30 seconds of your life right there. The other thing we need to know is PowerShell. SharePoint PowerShell in general is this command line thing, and every Microsoft product uses it. It is what we use to automate stuff. IT pros must know PowerShell. Developers, you do yourself a big favor by learning PowerShell. So that's another thing we need to learn. The other thing we need to learn are solution packages. As much as this is old history, conventional SharePoint development, we can't get rid of this 100% yet. So we need to learn this. And the last thing we need to learn about are apps. And apps, you've got many kinds of apps. So we're supposed to break at 1 o'clock, so I have almost an hour. Right? So I'm going to basically go through all of these options and give you a little taste test of what is it to develop for SharePoint. The first tip I can give you is get a nice laptop, right? Or expensive laptop. Because to develop for SharePoint, you almost have to virtualize. Because SharePoint is this big complicated platform which will let you shoot yourself in the foot, but you won't know until 2 months later. Right? SharePoint, when you install it on a machine, it owns the whole machine. It owns IIS. It owns a bunch of folders and the GAC and everything. So it is easy to make a mistake somewhere and not know about it until later. Or it is hard to back up the whole configuration of a SharePoint environment by Control-C, Control-V of code. Like in .NET, we can just get code, hit F5, and things just work. It doesn't work like that with SharePoint. So before you came in, I was working on something, and as a perfect example, I had to shut down my VM and prepare for this talk. But what happened was, the Windows said that I need to install 123 updates. I'm not kidding, it's true. The 123 updates. Some of us came in earlier and they saw that. And I figured that the updates would be done before people came in, but 15 minutes later, the updates were still not done. Right? So what do? I paused that VM, took a snapshot, booted another snapshot, and ready to go. Now, when I'm done with this talk, I'll go back to that snapshot and start it up again. And I'll continue where I left it. Right? So the thing is, I have to virtualize. And what am I virtualizing? I'm virtualizing a Windows Server machine, 2008 R2 or above. Right? And on this machine, I have to have a domain, I have to have Visual Studio, and I have to have full admin rights on this machine. So the choices I have for virtualizing are, I still prefer to carry my own laptop. I recently switched to Mac. It's the best decision I ever made, right? But there are a couple other laptops like Lenovo and Dell have enough memory to be able to handle that. Definitely get a fast hard disk, right? Don't run SharePoint on a spinning disk. Get an SSD. That's the main reason I got the Mac, is because the Mac its SSD is 10x faster than the SATA 3 SSDs. That makes a huge difference. Like I'll go through, like I'm going to go through these various pages over here, and this is just a freshly booted up SharePoint site. It doesn't feel slow, does it? It doesn't feel slow at all. Now it's running only on 12 gigs of RAM. It still doesn't feel slow. The VM has only 12 gigs of RAM. You can also virtualize in the cloud, but there are 2 reasons why I don't like that. Or 3 reasons. Reason number 1, I have to have good internet connectivity wherever I go, and that's not a guarantee. Right? Still, even today, that's not a guarantee. Reason number 2 is that developers, they don't fill their timesheets on time. They're not going to shut down the VM on time either. Right? So the cloud option ends up costing me more. But the option that really bugs me about the cloud is that it is very hard for me to take a snapshot in the cloud. Snapshotting in the cloud basically means that I have to shut down the VM and basically occupy 60 gigabytes of space for a snapshot. And the more snapshots I keep, the more I'm paying for storage. Even though storage is cheap, but over time it adds up. So I still prefer to have my own VM. Now, if you're developing apps only for Office 365 only, then technically you could develop using a Windows 8 VM or machine with Visual Studio installed on it. As in, you don't need SharePoint installed locally. But still, the user experience or your dev experience is not going to be smooth. So I would recommend get a machine like this. One day we'll get there, we're not there today. Alright, with that background, I'm going to start with PowerShell. So PowerShell, so console apps, if we have time for that, we'll cover that in the end, but that's actually pretty simple. So this blue icon down here is PowerShell. Looks blue, and it allows me to run commands. Now the best thing about PowerShell is that it teaches itself to me. Let's say I'm a Unix guy, right, and I've never been on a Windows machine before. What's the command for help on Unix? Man, okay, man. There you go. It tells me what to do, right? Or if I'm not a Unix guy, I could simply type help, right? So over here, with PowerShell, I can do some really cool things. Like for instance, if I want to know how can I, work with this computer, okay? So I can say help computer. Okay. You saw that I mistyped, but you saw the little progress bar that went at the top really quick? What that was, that the PowerShell 3.0 has a really neat feature in it, that it updates its help once every week, right? And if it's been more than a week since the last time I updated help, then for what I'm searching, it'll update it on demand, right? I can also type update help, and for everything that is currently loaded in PowerShell, it'll go on the internet and it'll get the latest help content for me, right? Now that's going to think a little, so let me just open another Power. See, it's going to, for all the modules that are loaded, it will download fresh help content from MSDN, right? So anytime I type help, it's always up to date. It's just really, really cool. Anyway, I'll let that run in the background. I'm going to go ahead and run another instance of PowerShell. So I wanted to see how can I work with this computer. And okay, that's pretty cool. So I have a command called add computer, right? Adds a local computer to a domain. That's cool. Remove, restart. Is there something called like get AD computer? Okay, get AD computer. And it's asking for a filter. Now, I know that in .NET or DOS or Windows or Unix, wherever, I can type star as a filter for match everything. So I'll just say star, and it tells me that on my domain over here, I have one computer, right? So usually, PowerShell will write out data like this, like it fetched an object for a computer, and it's returning me a collection over here. And if I want to get a different view of this, I can also type, something like this. I can say dash. See, I can do tab and it's got IntelliSense, right? So let's say if I forget the command, I can say get dash AD tab, 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 right? So I can go back here, get AD computer dash filter. So it helps me fill that out. I can type the filter, and then I can say format table, and I can say DNS hostname and enable, enter. And see, it formats it out like a table. It's easier for me to read. But what I just did over here is that I piped two commands together. FT is a short form for a PowerShell command called format table, format-table. So if I was to change this command to format-table, enter, it's the same thing. What I just did over here is that I took the results from one PowerShell command and piped it into another. What is the first command doing? It is getting me all the computers on my domain. And what is the second command doing? It is writing out the names of those. Okay? So here is a sure way to find another job in this industry. Restart AD computer. And if you have the rights to do this, with this one line of code, you'll be able to restart every computer in your company. Now, I'm not going to do this because we'll lose 5 minutes of our life and go back to the other part. Oh well, okay, let's open it again. Right. So you see that, how powerful PowerShell can be. No wonder they call it Windows powers hell. Right? So the thing is, it's a Windows PowerShell. It's a sharp two-edged sword. It's a needle. If you use it nicely, it's pretty darn powerful. But you can do some real damage with it too. Okay. Now, luckily, SharePoint has got a lot of protection built inside of it. Now let's look at that command that I was using a moment ago. Get AD computer. This is the syntax for every PowerShell command out there. Verb dash product name and noun. Okay? With the exception of MS Exchange, because MS Exchange was the first team that came out with PowerShell support, and they basically started using commands like this. They didn't know any better. So they occupied that real estate before anybody else could. Okay? But if I say get dash user, this is, well, I haven't loaded the module for MS Exchange over here, so I'm getting an error. But if I had loaded that module, I'd be able to, get an MS Exchange user. If I wanted an AD user, I literally have to type that. Okay, well, let's try one more time. And these are all the AD users. So over here, I can do something like this, filter star, FT name, and these are all the users, Active Directory users that are there on this domain. Now I want to start working with SharePoint. So I know SharePoint has a concept called site. So this is the regular PowerShell, okay? This is not the SharePoint PowerShell, and I'll tell you in advance that I've not loaded the SharePoint module yet. So I'm going to say help user or site. So SharePoint has got sites. And it tells me that I have 4 commandlets, but they all appear to be from IIS. How do I get SharePoint commands in here? So what I can do, I can say add ps snapping microsoft.sharepoint.powershell, and now I will get all the SharePoint commands loaded. I can use this mechanism to load other products as well, right? Now if I wanted to manage Office 365 with PowerShell, then I have to download and install a SharePoint Online Management Shell, right? And that gives me commands to work with Office 365. And now if I run the same command again over here, help site, now I'll get a few more commandlets. And now suddenly I realize that, the prefix for SharePoint, it's a product on its own, it's SP. So you know what, if I want to work with SharePoint sites, maybe I should say help SP site, and it'll give me a more targeted list of what I can do. Right? So for instance, I have a SharePoint site here called, test. This is the title of the site. So through PowerShell, can I get this title or can I change this title? Let's try. So I'm going to say help get SP site. So apparently I can get the site with this command here, and I can type examples to what I call as GDD, Google Driven Development, copy, paste, and run. So apparently it tells me is that I can say get SP site, and I can easily get the site with that mechanism. So I'm going to say $site is equal to get SP site HTTP SP enter, and $site, and apparently I have something in there, and I can say $site. So I forgot the property here. Like, how do I get webs of a site? I don't know, but I can do tap, 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 okay? So that's pretty cool. So if I forget the property, I can also do tap, tap, tap. So I know there is a property called root web, and that gives me the root web over there, and I can set title, and that gives me the title. So basically I'm just going through the object model. It's just like how you would expect PowerShell to behave. In fact, I can also say new title, crap, I mistyped, okay, one more time, $site.rootweb.update, and I'm going to come here, hit F5, and you see that the title changes. PowerShell is pretty simple, right? There are about 3,000 command lets in SharePoint. Once you memorize it all, you master PowerShell. No, you don't need to learn it that way. I don't learn it that way either. I just, when I want to figure something out, I just type help and try and figure it out that way. The cool thing is that the help that I see over here is the same help I see on MSDN. So once I'm in command prompt, I don't even need to think about it. So this is one way of using PowerShell. A better way of using SharePoint PowerShell is this. SharePoint 2013 Management Shell. Why is this a better way? Because if you do right-click properties on that, I'm going to go ahead and open this in Notepad. What you'll see here is, you see that it is running PowerShell, but it is loading this file over here, right? SharePoint PS1. And what I'm going to do is that I am going to open this file in Notepad. File, open, no, and open. And what do we see in here? It is doing add PS snap-in. That's pretty cool. But one of the things it is doing is that it has embedded a certificate over here, with which it is identifying itself to SharePoint object model. And that means that for a lot of things that I want to do, I don't have to do set execution policy unrestricted. So preferably, if you're working with SharePoint, you should use the SharePoint 2013 Management Shell. And just like before, the same tricks apply. Help SP site, help SP user, help SP web application, right? So that's pretty cool. Help SP. Well, that's different. That SP is actually a set item property command, so it gave me out for that. Anyway, so that's the second way to use PowerShell. The third way to use PowerShell is to use PowerShell IC. PowerShell IC is the development, or call it the Visual Studio for PowerShell. And the cool thing about PowerShell IC is that its IntelliSense is a little bit better, right? And what's really nice is that if I'm writing a long script, then I can run it in debug mode. I can click this button and create a script, and now I can start writing my logic here. So just like before, if I wanted to import the PowerShell module, I would say import, it was add PS snap-in, right? And I can say Microsoft.SharePoint.PowerShell. And now, if I start typing stuff like this, I can say get SP, and now you see that I have better IntelliSense, right? SP site, and I have tool tips and all that. And actually, what's even nicer is that I can go to the right over here, click refresh. I can select the PowerShell module here, SharePoint module over here, and I can find whatever command I was working with. Okay, so like get SP site, and it gives me a little wizard-like thing that I can use on the right-hand side to fill it out and basically give me a command. And once I've been writing my PowerShell script over here, I can run it in debug mode. I can set breakpoints, just like Visual Studio. So when I'm trying to write a long script that I'm debugging and I'm trying to figure things out, I would use PowerShell ISC, right? So let me show you a little trick that I use quite often with PowerShell. This is actually also on my site. So I'm going to quickly go to my site. I'm going to borrow code from there. SharePoint 2013 PowerShell trick. Here we go. Scroll, scroll, scroll. So they've added a very interesting command in SharePoint 2013 called diagnostic sessions, right? frequently what happens is that I give this script to my IT ogre and he runs it, and it worked fine in the QA environment and it's not working in production. Now we have distrust going on. The IT ogre says, you know, I ran whatever you gave me, and I'm like, it has to work. If you ran it properly, it has to work. I don't trust it. Wouldn't it be nice if when he ran the script in the closed room that I could get a log output of that, right? So the way SharePoint logs work is that there is a directory inside of SharePoint and C program files, common files, Microsoft shared, CD web server extensions, and in here there's a directory called 15. This is also called as the SharePoint root. And inside here you will find a directory called logs, and this is where SharePoint is continuously logging a lot of information. Right? So what happens is that anytime SharePoint throws an error, we would get an error message that looks like this. Wish I could make it a little bit bigger. But this is so funny, I just had to share this. Oh no, not that. Like this one here. So, you know, so what does my boss, as a SharePoint control, what does my boss think I do? What do my users think I do? It's like pulling a rabbit out of an ad. What do my friends think I do? What my family thinks I do? What I think I do? And what I really do is, you know, figure out SharePoint errors all day. Right? So when SharePoint throws an error, it doesn't give you the actual error message, it gives you a GUID, and that GUID is called as the correlation ID. And then you would take that correlation ID and then you would search for that correlation ID in the logs directory over here. So you see these log files that are continuously being written all the time, like these down here, you would search for that GUID in there. The problem is that these logs are not the easiest to read, and secondly, if I just gave somebody a PowerShell script, you know, how do I know what correlation ID they use? It's random, it's GUID, except in 2013 I can control that GUID now. That's called as a diagnostics session. So I can say, let me just clean out all the log files. Just a second, let me open loss prompt. Percent 15%. So a quick way to go there, I create this environment variable, and now I can say del dot yes, and now all the log files are gone. So I have just one log file to worry about. Things will run quicker. That's why I did that. Okay. Now I have a lot of content. I realize I'm going a little fast, but you know, I just have a lot of content to cover. I do offer SharePoint 5-day and 3-day and 1-day trainings. If you're interested in that, let me know. My next open course is in Oslo on March 19th. But I can also do in-house courses. I've done many in the past. Okay, so let's continue. So basically, what we can do is that first we start by creating a little correlation ID. Right? It's a little GUID that we're creating on our own. We have a GUID. Second, I'm going to start our diagnostics session using the command start SP diagnostics session. I'm saying I want to do this in trace level verbose. Capture as much information as you can. Again, if you forgot the syntax of this, what would you do? Help. So I've started a diagnostic session. Now I'm going to go ahead and run a couple of commands. Maybe a few that will give me an error. So this command should work, and this command should give me an error. Okay? When I'm done with this, I can stop the diagnostic session and now I have that correlation ID, and I can filter my log with this correlation ID. So I'm going to run this command here, and just like I had piped two commands earlier together, I'm now piping three commands together. The first one gets all the content of all the log files. Second one filters it for the word, the correlation ID. And the third one sticks it in my clipboard. And now I'm going to open Notepad, reduce the font a little bit because it's a lot of data. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that, and bingo. This is my entire log for the commands that I executed. Remember, SharePoint is a server. There's a lot going on the server all the time. But with this, I was able to, with a surgical precision, I was able to chisel out just the log entries that I care about. And if I was doing this on a load balanced environment, I would have to do one more step. And that is run another command called merge splog, which is going to take these ULS logs from all web front ends and combine them on this one web front end, and then I can run my command. Okay? You're going to find this very, very useful in diagnosing SharePoint errors or supporting your SharePoint installations. Of course, there are a lot more tips and tricks, but let's switch gears and move out of PowerShell and dive into solution packages, sandbox solutions, and fawn solutions. Any questions so far? Anybody learned anything new so far? Cool. So I'm going to click on this new project link. Visual Studio is going to make me wait a little. Hourglass. And the SharePoint project templates are, inside here in Visual Studio. So if I want to write old-fashioned SharePoint code, by that I mean WSPs, I would use this section here. And in here, the project templates, as you can see, are grouped into 2013 and 2010. If you worked with SharePoint or Visual Studio 2012 or before, you'll see that the project templates have been simplified a lot. And the reason they've done that is because we didn't use the other project templates. Most of us, we always went with empty project, right? And then whatever we needed to do, we would add that into the empty project. Now they still left the Silverlight web part and the visual web part up here because those are new. There are new things there, so they wanted to draw some attention to it, right? And the import solution package is something that I've never found useful. Because whenever I import another solution package, it generates code and it generates such bad code that I don't want to use it. So I never use it. For instance, there's an out-of-the-box workflow in SharePoint. The out-of-the-box approval workflow in SharePoint has got one step, approve. And when you export that workflow as a WSP from SharePoint Designer and import that in Visual Studio, the resulting workflow looks like this. It took me about half an hour to do this import. There's no way I'm going to maintain this code, right? You know that little thing you see at the bottom down there, that right there? That's the log to history activity list. That's, I'm not going to use this. So the import option is absolutely useless. I've never found any use for it. But this is pretty useful, so let's start with this. So I'm going to create the world's simplest SharePoint project. We're going to start with a sandbox solution, and you can change it to a farm solution later if you wish. So I'm going to start with sandbox because if I can, deliver some functionality using sandbox, then why bother writing a farm solution? So it creates a basic SharePoint project for me. I'm going to go ahead and add new item, and I'm going to add a web part. Now you see there are a lot of other things I can add as well, but a web part is something that we see all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and add a web part. And it adds all the necessary artifacts to make a web part work, and it gives me a little place to write the code. So I'm just going to say this.controls.add new literal, right? I'm going to say text is equal to hello world. Save and run, and that's it. I'm writing SharePoint code now. But there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. What it is doing now is that it showed me the log down there, which just disappeared, but we can get it back. See, what it did behind the scenes is that it went ahead and packaged up my code as a WSP file. And a WSP file is a CAD file. And the CAD file contains a manifest.xml, which tells SharePoint what is inside this WSP. And what is inside this WSP? Well, we know it's a web part that we're deploying. That's what I just wrote. But in a WSP, you can have one or more files, or actually 0 to infinite files, and you can have 0 to infinite features. And a file is something that you just want to copy and use, like a JavaScript file that will just download, or a CSS that will just download. It goes on the file system, physical file system. Whereas a feature is something, it's a logical group of functionality that I can activate or deactivate. And by activating a feature, I get a whole bunch of things. Like I'm creating a timesheet feature. So by activating it, I'm going to get one web part, one list, and an approval workflow. By activating a feature, I can group all these three things together into something logical that makes sense for the user, the administrator sort of user. And features can also be activated on different scopes. So there are a lot of features that are available in SharePoint out of the box. I can go to site settings, and I can go down here and click site collection features, and you see that I have a lot of choices here, right? So if I want to activate the SharePoint publishing infrastructure, that's a feature. If I activate it, I'll get a whole bunch of things available for me. And if I want to get rid of it, I will click deactivate. Now you see down here, this is the feature that we wrote. And it has been activated for us by Visual Studio. Right? And this feature had a web part in it. So now technically I can go to this page, I can edit this page. And what is a web part? It's a pre-packaged bit of functionality that we didn't have to write, but we can use. And these are some web parts that are available out of the box. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these because I want to make space for the web part that we wrote, because our web part is far nicer. And I'm going to click on this insert button and click on web part, go to custom, select this web part that we have written, click add, and bingo, we have our web part running. Well, in a moment. Let's go. So, you know, the coolest thing about being a SharePoint consultant is that, first of all, yeah, SharePoint guys, you know, we make a lot of money, but the other cool thing is that half of that money is made watching progress bars. Right? Okay. So you see Untitled Hello World, our web part is running nicely. This has been deployed as a sandbox solution. So I can go into site action, site settings, solutions gallery, and bingo, I see the web part over here, the solution package over there. Right? And the cool thing is that there is no flag inside of a solution package that tells SharePoint that this is a sandbox solution versus this is a farm solution. A sandbox solution runs under different level of, you know, access. It's more restricted, right? But the way it runs under different level of access is how you deploy it is different. So to deploy a sandbox solution, I would go to the front end and I would click this upload solution and find this file and upload it and activate it. And I have a sandbox solution ready to go. Right? For instance, I'm going to stop debugging here and I'll do this process manually, like the end users would have to do. And it'll get rid of this solution, as you can see up here. So I'm going to go to HTTPSP. The web part will still be there because, you know, I dropped it manually. So it's going to give an error because the underlying code is gone. Visual Studio retracted it. But if I go into site action, site settings, solution gallery, and that solution package is gone too. But now what I can do is that I can take the same project, click on this publish link over here, and I can publish this to, you know, my file system, and it'll package up this project as a WSP file, and I can come in here, upload it, this shouldn't take long, activate it, and now go back to the home page, and the web part is functional again. This is a sandbox solution, right? And the same solution can be deployed as a form solution without recompiling. So in order to deploy it as a form solution, I would have to RDP to the server, and I would have to do it using PowerShell, and I'd have to do it as a format. Right? We'll leave that for another day. But because every sandbox solution is going to work as a form solution, just take my word for it. Because you're going from less writes to more writes. But the same WSP is going to work either way. And the commands you use for that are add SP solution to add the solution package into central administration, install SP solution to actually deploy it somewhere, and then activate SP feature to activate the actual feature. You can do all of that through PowerShell. So we'll leave that for another day because I want to talk a little bit about apps before we call it a day. So now I'll switch gears and start talking about apps. Now the biggest problem with all the code that we've written so far is that it's in the guts of SharePoint. Right? And we don't like that for various reasons. Because SharePoint is a sausage factory. Right? The internal API is really bad. Let me just put it that way. It feels like high school kids wrote it. So, like I actually saw, I was using Reflector to look at all the code inside of SharePoint when SharePoint 2010 was in beta, and I said, here's some NDA information. I put this on my site, and what I found in there was that there was a function called as try and deactivate feature. And it's like, well, if you would try it, that makes me nervous, but okay. And inside of that, there was a try catch. And in the finally of that try catch, there was another method called that said try and deactivate feature anyway. This is real SharePoint code inside the object model of SharePoint. We don't see this, but you can reflector it out, right? So the SharePoint object, and I can give you hundreds of such examples which make me bang my head against SharePoint. So the one thing I'll tell you about, if you're thinking about SharePoint seriously, and if you are a .NET developer, once you get over the gag factor, it's pretty cool. Right? But first you do have to get over the gag factor. Once you, coming from a .NET background, when you see SharePoint, you'll be like, man, the dev tools suck. Who wrote this platform? I need to do IS resets all the time. But eventually you start seeing positive things about it, because while you're doing IS resets, you can catch up on YouTube, right? It's not so bad. So I'm going to click on this app for SharePoint project, and this is how we write apps. Now the advantage of apps is that they work outside of SharePoint, right? So we don't have to deal with the messiness of SharePoint, let's call it that. How many in here are MVC developers? ASP.NET MVC. Do you like MVC? Why do you like MVC? Because it's cleaner, nicer, it's better than web forms because the pages are lighter, they give me more control. MVC is where the world is headed, etc. You can write SharePoint apps in MVC. You can't write regular SharePoint code in MVC, but you can write SharePoint apps in MVC. So I'm going to click on App for SharePoint 2013, click OK. Now there are three different kinds of apps. Okay, now I'm only going to show SharePoint hosted app over here, right? And if you want to do MVC, then you have to go with provider hosted app. Now what's the difference between these? A SharePoint hosted app runs wholly out of SharePoint. As in, I don't need to set up another server on the site. But the disadvantage of a SharePoint hosted app is it cannot have any server-side code, right? I cannot have any C# code. Everything I need to do, I have to do it using JavaScript. So as long as you can live with that, then a SharePoint hosted app simplifies your deployment hassles, right? There are other disadvantages of SharePoint hosted apps as well. In fact, a lot of disadvantages. Upgrades are a pain. Right? It's not impossible to do an upgrade, but it's hard to do an upgrade. But another huge disadvantage is that SharePoint hosted apps will not work with any other authentication other than Windows authentication. It won't even work with ADFS. Right? Why? We'll cover that in the post-ground workshop, but let me cover a few golden rules about apps. So, a couple of golden rules about apps. Oh, come on, let's go. Right. Golden Golden rules about apps. Apps will never run any code on the SharePoint server. That's golden rule number 1. Right? Any C# code or anything like that on the SharePoint server itself. Apps will never do that. Golden rule number 2. So basically, I'm going to explain that a little bit, is that the browser is going to talk to a completely different URL. And that's your app's URL. And through that URL, we will talk to SharePoint. Rule number 2, apps are downloaded and installed, just like apps on your phone. And you can download and install them from the marketplace, as in the app store that Microsoft has set up, corporate catalog, which is an enterprise app store, and you can have many of these in your company, or directly through the API. You can just make an app available without having to install it. In the user interface, they call lists and document libraries apps, but those are not apps. Lists are lists, document libraries are document libraries, and apps, real apps, are totally different from what a list is. That's a UI thing that they're calling everything an app now. And apps never run from the same URL as the SharePoint site. And you should not try and get around this mechanism, because the security model of apps depends on this. And the reason for that is that your browser is talking to a different URL, which is the app's URL, and it cannot access SharePoint resources directly because AJAX will not allow cross-domain calls like that. So in order for your browser to talk to SharePoint, it has to go through the app, and by going through the app, SharePoint knows which app it is coming through. And the app gets permissions just like a user gets permissions. So if the app has write access and you are trying to write to SharePoint, then your request will succeed. Features can be installed on 4 different scopes. Apps are always installed on an SP web, the lowest possible scope. Now there's a slight difference between making an app available for install versus actually installing the app. When I make an app available for an install, I'm putting the app in the app catalog. Right? And when I'm actually going to use the app is when I install it. So installing the app is basically, I go to site action, site settings over here. Okay, let's go to SharePoint. And I click on this button here, add an app. When I say installing the app, is basically I'm going through this process over here. That I'm installing an app from here. And where I install the app, we call that as the host web. And optionally, not always, optionally, an app can provision another SP web over there, which is called as the app web. The app has got full control on app web, and the app has defined the level of control on the host web. The developer, when they're writing the app, chooses what level of access does the app have to the host web. And the person that is installing the app needs to have that level of access to install the app. So if the app is asking for write access and I have only read access, I cannot install the app. Now obviously all of these have a little bit, special cases, fine print and all that. We'll cover that in another session. Okay. Again, where I install the app is the host web. Optionally, I can create an app web, and then I can have a completely separate web application. It doesn't even have to be .NET. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a web app. It could be, Objective-C iPhone app. Right? And sometimes apps need server-side code, like maybe a timer job. but not a SharePoint timer job, but something that needs to happen without the user clicking upon it. Something that runs on a schedule. So you're going to need a server-side component. There are other reasons why you may need server-side components as well. And in that scenario, you'll need to have a server other than SharePoint on the side. And there are two choices there. You can create and set up a server yourself. That's called as a provider-hosted app. And another choice is an auto-hosted app where a server other than SharePoint is set up for you in Azure when the app is installed. Right? And when you have a separate server on the other side, somehow that server needs to be trusted inside of SharePoint. And that trust establishment is done using either OAuth or S2S trust. Now what are these? We'll cover that in another session. But at a high level, you need to establish this trust. So these are some golden rules about apps. Remember, one was, hey, it runs from a different URL. So let's keep that in mind, that apps always run from a different URL. And with that in mind, let's look at the process of writing the simplest possible app, which is a SharePoint hosted app. So I'm inside of Visual Studio. I'm going to choose to create a SharePoint hosted app. I'm going to click on Finish. And this will basically generate all the code necessary for my app to talk to SharePoint. Now, the way an app talks to SharePoint, it uses either REST or CSOM. The generated code over here uses CSOM. And what exactly is this code doing? Is that it is basically an ASPX that is referencing jQuery and the SharePoint object model script, and it is referencing app.css, which is part of my project, and app.js, which is also part of my project. And down here, there is a paragraph with ID message, okay? And under scripts folder here, if I go in here, what it's doing is that when the document loads, right, it runs a CSOM call to load the username. And once it gets the username, it writes that in that paragraph. That's the logic of this app. So at the end of this, it should say, hello administrator, if everything goes fine. You know, the SharePoint, things sometimes don't go fine. Actually, they won't. They won't because I'm running on very less memory, and that is an excuse for me to show you another tip, dev environment specific tip, but it may or may not work. Let me put it that way, because I'm running on very low memory. But anyway, let's try. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this play button, which will deploy my app, it'll package it, and damn, it errors out, right? You may or may not run into this. You'll run into this on low memory environments. Now, what is it saying? Error occurred in deployment step, requested service could not be activated. Basically, the app management service, managed service, is a WCF endpoint. It's saying that endpoint could not be activated. Well, crap, what happened? I'm going to go to event log here. And let's go to Windows logs, application. And I see some errors down here, which are coming from system.service model. And the error says that memory gate checking failed because the free memory is less than 5% of total memory. So I'm running everything on a Mac. Unfortunately, Macs don't come in 32 gigs. So I had to buy one with 16 gigs. My VM is running on 12 gigs, which is too less for SharePoint. So if I go over here and I click on Start Task Manager, I've consumed all that memory. And WCF, when it sees that you have less than 5% memory available in your system, WCF says, sorry, can't run. Of course, you can fix this. But on a dev environment, the easiest way to fix this, let's do this little trick here. I'm going to say always on top, and let's see how much memory I can recover and how quickly. I'm going to go to HTTP SP 40,000, which is central administration. And I'm going to first go into manage services on server. And I'm going to go ahead and turn distributed cache off. Again, do this only in dev environment. And that gave me about 1 gigabyte back. And I can tell you that's more than enough for these services to work now. But I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to go into manage service applications. And actually, over here, if I go to processes, sort on memory, other than SQL Server, the most memory is being consumed by a process called noderunner.exe, which is related with SharePoint search. SharePoint search can fire up to 4 node runners. So I'm going to go down here, I'm going to find search service application. Let's go back to memory. I'm going to find search service application, select it, and I'll get rid of it. Now what does this mean? Hey, this means that search is no longer going to work on this machine. And that's a downside. So if I was developing for search, yeah, that'd be a problem. But if I'm developing for search, and one of my sessions on Thursday is search and search only, then I would just delete the other services on the side. Usually I can pick and choose what services I want to get rid of. And if I do that, I can usually claim a lot of memory back. So it's going to take like about another 30 seconds to delete that web app, delete search, and let's see how much memory it gives me back. So when it says this shouldn't take long, that's a total lie. So look at that, 8 gigs, 7, so yeah, it's pretty good. I think I can continue now. So I'm going to come back here. It'll actually go even further down when it's done. Now when I try and deploy the app, it'll package the app, it'll deploy it. See, now it's working. And it writes our color administrator. This is a simple SharePoint hosted app. Now, obviously, both in the topic of WSPs and PowerShell and apps, there's a lot more to learn, right? But I hope this was a good introduction into what is it like to develop for SharePoint, the kinds of issues we run into, the kinds of hardware we need, etc., etc. So, to end, I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope you got something useful out of it. I have 3 sessions on Thursday and a post-con workshop. Please remember to fill the feedbacks. And I do trainings and consulting. This tab is, woefully out of date because I never get time to update it. But I also organize, open courses and in-house courses in London. So if anybody's interested, just hit this contact button on my site, or just send me an email and send me a quick email, and I'd love to talk further. And please remember to fill the feedback. And hopefully see you in some of the other sessions. Have a great conference. Thank you very much.